Hello upgraders and welcome to today's episode of the Upgraded Ape Show. On today's show I'm joined by Steven Kotler, who's a New York Times bestselling author, award-winning journalist, and he's the co-founder and director of research at the Flow Genome Project. We're going to talk about flow, what it is, how we get into it, and the unbelievable effects it can have on performance. Steven talked about the military seeing a 200 to 500% faster rate of learning whilst being in the flow state. We also touch on why time starts to look funny and feel funny when you're in a flow state, and why it wouldn't be possible to spend the whole of your life in there even if it sounds amazing. So without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Upgraded Ape Show, your daily dose of brain upgrades to help you kick life's ass. And here's your host, Will Barron.
Thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Steven, let's dive straight into this. Can you give us a bit of a definition of flow?
Absolutely. Technically, flow is defined as an optimal state of consciousness. That's a state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. And I think most people have at least a passing understanding of flow. If you've ever gotten so sucked into a work project that everything else is forgotten, if you've lost an afternoon in a great conversation, right? You've tasted this experience. In flow, attention gets so laser focused on the task at hand that everything else disappears. Our sense of self, our sense of self-consciousness, they vanish. Time dilates, which means sometimes it speeds up, 5 hours pass by in 5 minutes. Sometimes it slows down and you get that freeze frame effect like in a car crash or in the Matrix. And throughout, all aspects of performance, mental and physical, go through the roof.
There's a couple of things that you mentioned there that I really want to dive into. The time side of thing I think is absolutely fascinating. I'd like to touch on that. But is there any biological or neurological things that happen when we get into the state of flow? Leading on to the question, obviously, that everyone will be thinking of how do we induce this state to increase our performance?
Okay, so where to start so here's what we know. Flow science goes back about 150 years. We've got a really good picture of the psychology. Over the past 30 years, as neuroscience has kind of advanced, as the technology has advanced, we're starting to get a really good picture of the neurobiology, what's going on in the brain. And we're right now at the front edge of starting to peel back the veil on the physiology, what's going on in the body. That said, what we already know is that flow is ubiquitous, shows up in anybody, anywhere, provided certain initial conditions are met. Those conditions, which are the second question you asked, which is, yes, this state is available to anybody. There are 17 flow triggers. These are preconditions that lead to more flow. They're essentially all the flow triggers. Flow takes place in the present moment. So every one of these triggers are essentially ways of driving attention into the now, driving attention into the present moment. And they're literally just the 17 ways that evolutionary biology shaped our brain to pay attention to the present moment. So yes, anybody can increase the amount of flow in their lives.
From that point then, these flow triggers, are there any obvious ones that people could use, immediately after listening to this podcast to increase their level of flow, just in general?
Of course, for sure. Their broad picture, there are 3 environmental triggers. These are external triggers. There are 3 psychological triggers. These are internal triggers. There's 1 creative trigger. And then, so what we've been talking about so far is individual flow. There's also a collective version of the state. When a bunch of people get into a flow state together, it's known as group flow. And if you've ever taken part in a great brainstorming session, or played in a band, or sung in a church choir, or seen a great fourth quarter comeback in sports when everybody on the team is in the exact right place at the exact right time, then you've seen group flow in action. And there are 10 social triggers that can bring on more group flow. Any of these can be applied by anybody in any situation. We'll start really basically with the first internal or psychological trigger, which is probably the most famous, and it's known as the challenge skills ratio. So as I said, all these triggers are ways of driving attention into the present moment. So when we pay most attention to the now, the challenge we're facing slightly exceeds the skills we bring to bear on it. So for flow to happen, emotionally flow takes place sort of near the midpoint between anxiety and boredom. Boredom means there's not enough stimulation. You're not paying enough attention because you're just not engaged in what you're doing. Anxiety means there's too much stimulation, right? And you're overwhelmed and you no longer perform well. In between is this sweet spot where we stretch but we don't snap. That sweet spot basically maximizes the attention we can play to the present moment and maximizes the amount of flow. What that basically means for individuals is if you want to increase the amount of flow in your life, you have to constantly be rising to meet new challenges.
Amazing. With the flow triggers, do you have to have multiple at once? Do they stack up on top of each other? Or are there particular ones that you can zone in and focus on to get yourself into that state of flow?
Well, it seems like there are a number that show up across the boards. You have to have massively enhanced attention, right? Attention in the present moment is kind of fundamental to all of these. It seems like some level of risk-taking. Doesn't have to be physical. It can be mental, emotional, social, intellectual. Any of those things needs to be present. And this is the same thing as we just talked about, right? The challenge needs to be slightly greater than the skills you bring to bear. But the answer to your question is it varies individually to individually. Some of this is genetic, right? There are neurochemicals and a lot of neurobiology underpinning the state. Certain people are more susceptible to different neurochemicals than others. Some of this is the environment you grew up in. So with the triggers, you kind of have to experiment. And by the way, if you search 17 flow triggers in Steven Kotler, there's a slide share out there that's free that anybody can see. It lists all 17 and kind of breaks them down.
Perfect. That's amazing. So we've talked about how to induce it, and I'll link to that slideshow in the show notes. Can you touch on the benefits? I mean, I think we'll all know the anecdotal benefits of you sit there, you do some work, and you 2 or 3 hours pass. I know you've talked about mountain biking in the past and downhill riding, and I do a bit of the same. Throw yourself down, and your mind's totally blank, and you're totally focused on the situation, and it's an amazing feeling. Can you touch on some of the other potential benefits leading on to the applications that flow can be used for?
Of course. The research on flow, it kind of goes across the boards, and we call it ultimate human performance for a reason. So in flow, a number of different changes take place in the brain, all of which drive performance. First of all, in the state, we are better, we are faster, we are stronger, we are more agile, we are more dexterous. All that is true. But so are our brains. In flow, we're taking in more information per second. We're processing it more deeply, meaning we're using more of the brain to process it, and we're processing it more quickly. And flow does more than kind of jack up just information processing. It also boosts pattern recognition, future prediction. These are basic fundamental neuronal processes in the brain that are massively amplified by flow. As a result, for example, McKinsey & Company, the big business consultancy, did a 10-year study where they found top executives report being 5 times more productive in flow than out of flow. So 5 times more productive is staggering. That's a 500% boost in productivity. It means that you can go to work on Monday, spend Monday in a flow state, take Tuesday through Friday off, and get as much done as your steady state peers. We know that motivation is so accelerated in flow that researchers talk about flow as the source code of intrinsic motivation, which means that once this experience starts producing flow, we will go exceptionally far out of our way to get more of it. We know that creativity, for various reasons, is massively enhanced during flow. In some studies run by my organization, the Flow Genome Project, we've seen 700% increases in creativity. We also know that learning is massively accelerated in flow. In studies run by the U.S. military, snipers in flow learned an average of 200 to 500% faster than normal. And we understand kind of all the neurobiology why, but it really truly is ultimate human performance. It just surrounds all aspects and amplifies all of them.
Well, it sounds almost too good to be true. Is there any issues if you were to force yourself into a flow state for long periods of time? I'm just thinking from the neurological effects. Would you need any, increased sleep or anything like that?
Couple of things. Flow is not a binary. It's not a light switch. So used to be we thought you were either in the zone or you're out of the zone. You were then in flow or out of flow. Turns out that's not true at all. It's actually a 4-stage cycle. So you have to move through all these stages before you can kind of restart the flow cycle, before you can go back into flow, right? You have to kind of go through the whole cycle once, and then you start over again, which means you can't kind of live perpetually in flow. And one of the reasons, and you touched on it, is that the state is neurochemically and neurobiologically expensive to produce. For example, in flow, the brain produces a cocktail of 5 of the most potent neurochemicals it can produce. All of these are expensive for the brain to make. We need certain calories, certain vitamins, certain minerals. It takes a little while for this stuff to replenish. So you can't really live in this perpetual flow state. That said, there is also a danger, right? This is not, we talk about this and we say this is not self-help, and it's not self-help for 2 reasons. On the positive, self-help is a 5 to 10% gain, and we're not talking about that. We're talking about a step function worth of change. The flip side is there's a very, very dark side to flow. For example, the 5 neurochemicals that show up in the state, besides being significant performance-enhancing chemicals, are all the most feel-good pleasure chemicals the brain can produce. They're all extremely, extremely, extremely addictive. So when you're in a flow state for a while and then you come down out of that state, it's biophysically roughly the same as coming off drugs. There's a craving, there's a wanting, there's a depression that follows the high. So there are lows, and you have to learn to manage those lows. If you want this level of accelerated performance, it takes a certain amount of emotional control.
From the neurochemical side of things then, would your diet and what you're eating day to day affect the ability for you to get into a flow state then?
Obviously, the answer is yes. What we don't know, so the science of neurochemistry, flow, if you want to talk about what happens in the brain during flow, you have to talk about neuroanatomy, which is where something takes place. You have to talk about neuroelectricity and neurochemicals, which are the 2 ways the brain communicates, right? It sends signals both electrically and chemically. Of the 3, neurochemistry is this area we know the least about. And it's because we can't yet at the ion channel level measure neurochemicals in the brain. It's how do you insert a sensor, how do you take it back out? So we're always working secondhand from the neurochemicals presence in the bloodstream, and that doesn't give us the greatest data. So the point is, yes, we know these 5 neurochemicals show up during flow, but it's going to be totally individual. What's the order of the cascade? It's going to differ from situation to situation, and we don't really know how to produce more of these neurochemicals in the brain. There's nothing. Anandamide, for example, is one of the neurochemicals that shows up in flow. It also shows up in chocolate, but there is 0 data that says eating more chocolate will help you get in more flow. We just don't know. So yes, nutrition plays a part, but at the Flow Genome Project, we tell people, you want to follow a healthy diet. You want to, mostly a Mediterranean diet. You want to eat lots of variety of foods, most of them fruits, vegetables, and fish. And that's about as far as it goes. It's the same, kind of dietary recommendations that any high performance athlete would follow.
Sure. Tell me a bit more about the Flow Genome Project, Steven. What are your long-term goals with the project, and where are you now with it?
So there's a lot of different arms in the Flow Genome Project. Part of it is already up and running. Part of it we teach classes on flow. We work with corporations on flow. We work with athletes. So we've been doing all that stuff for a while. We are also involved in research. Our eventual goal is to map the psychology onto the neurobiology onto the physiology to create kind of a heat map of flow. So you can kind of take any person and figure out, okay, this is the easiest way to get them into flow. And, to crack that nut, we're sort of taking, I hate this term, but we're taking a big data approach to flow. We've created what we're calling flow dojos. These are dedicated flow research and training facilities. We'll be running tons of people through these facilities, getting them into flow, and then just data capturing along the way so we can really, really, really start to kind of come at this problem from every direction.
You said that there's 4 stages to go through, which it might be worth diving into a little bit more what the stages are. But do you think we'll be at a point where the average individual will be able to, and commonly just be able to turn on and off?
So we already there, for example, let's talk about neuroanatomy for half a second to make this clear. Flow, one of the things that causes flow is you're trading slower and more energy expensive and more limited conscious processing for much quicker, much more energy efficient, and almost limitless in terms of kind of storage and subconscious processing. When this happens, the brain turns off large portions of the prefrontal cortex. So this is the part of your brain that houses all of your higher cognitive function, your executive function, your sense of will, your sense of morality. You asked about time dilation. Why does time get funky in flow? Because time is calculated all over the prefrontal cortex, and as parts of it start to shut down, we can no longer perform that calculation. So we can now fake that process. It's called transient hypofrontality. Transient means temporary. Hypo, H-Y-P-O, means to slow down or deactivate, and frontality is the prefrontal cortex. We can induce transient hypofrontality with transcranial magnetic stimulation. You can literally just knock out the prefrontal cortex, and they've done this in studies. There was an Australian study recently where they gave 40 people a really tricky brain teaser to solve, one that needs a lot of creativity to solve. Nobody could solve the problem. They induced flow artificially using transcranial magnetic stimulation. They knocked out the prefrontal cortex, and 23 people solved the problem in record time. So you can, that's not the full flow effect, right? You're still missing neurochemistry, and you're still missing neuroelectrical changes and, other biological changes, but it's part of it. There's also brainwave entrainment things you can do, and a number of different companies are actually coming out with consumer EEG devices that let you kind of train the brain to the alpha theta brainwave borderline where flow takes place. So there's bits and pieces of the system that we can already hack with technology. Flow in a pill, that's a lot farther out. I don't actually know if that's ever going to happen. There's a lot of proof that flow is an emergent property, that it is a result of a complex system doing a whole bunch of things at once, and that it may never lend itself to a pill. But for certain, there's technology available already, and there's definitely training techniques. The 17 flow triggers and a knowledge of the flow cycle is enough to really significantly increase the amount of flow in your life.
Is there any link between flow and different types of meditation, for example? Seem to have similar properties on some fronts. Wondering if there's any link there.
There are and there are not. So we talked about transient hypofrontality. In deep meditation, you also get transient hypofrontality. Some of the same structures that shut down in flow are shut down. There are also different structures shut down and different structures that are hyperactive. So there's variations. There are differences in brain waves. Flow kind of sits on the border between alpha, theta, and really, really deep meditators get deeper into theta than in flow. So there are differences. The thing is, meditation or mindfulness training, right, which is really just a way of training a focus into the now, has a massive impact on performance, which is why athletes use it, and military special forces use it. The Navy SEALs has a box breathing technique that is essentially a Vipassana meditation technique given a different name. So there's a lot of correlation between mindfulness focus training, being able to pay attention to the present moment and keep your focus there, and keep kind of practice emotional regulation so you stay calmer. Those have massive benefits and really help flow. But there are differences.
I mean, going back to the Flow Genome Project for a second, just for my audience and everyone that's listening, is there any way that they can help or get involved, or essentially?
Absolutely.
flowgenomeproject.co is our website. And first of all, there's tons of information on the website, including a free flow diagnostic. So as I said, everybody kind of prefers different paths into flow, different flow triggers. This is a simple, fast 10-question diagnostic that sort of is a quick personality assessment that shows you which areas in your life you're likely to find the most flow. So that's there for everybody. There's videos. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. And we also run flow fundamentals classes online. So these are 6 weeks, an hour and a half a week, live with myself and Jamie Wheel, who's the executive director of the Flow Genome Project, that run for 6 weeks, and anybody can sign up for those. And we also have live events. So you can find all that on flowgenomeproject.co.
Excellent. Well, Steven, I think that would be a perfect time to wrap up the call. Where else can my audience find more about you and more about the Rise of the Superman book?
I mean, riseofsuperman.com is the site around the book, and there are also on that site you'll find 4 or 5 videos, the Flow video series, which is myself and top world-class action adventure sport athletes and top world-class creatives talking about flow. And, there's one on flow and creativity and one on flow and ultimate human performance. So there's a whole set.
Excellent. Well, thanks again for coming on the show, Steven.
Thanks for having me.